people joining up at the start of the First World War, we often hear stories of the fact, that they were taking teenage boys in, that they were lying about their age, come back, come back through the door when you're 19, son, and all of the rest of it. But this fascinating story here, James Briggs, he enlisted when he was 16 years of age, completely legally. Yeah, he was an apprentice gardener, and obviously to break the terms of his indenture at that time was, that's a serious thing. He'd entered into a legal contract with his apprentice master, and therefore, in order to enlist, he actually had to get a signed document from Dixon and Company, who was sort of a grounds maintenance company, to say that he could enlist, and obviously as he was too young to be enlisted at the age of 16, he actually had got a signed note from his mum saying that she actually gave her permission as his legal guardian to enlist. And it seems about the only place that would take him at the age of 17 was the Royal Army Medical Corps, and he worked as a cook in Craigleith War Hospital. So no doubt he would have seen Louis Rupert on a day-to-day basis up and down on the wards there. And again, very much like so many of the stories that we'll be hearing about here, he dies of a chest infection, and then chest infection becomes pneumonia, just like Louis Rupert. Pericarditis came on from there, and he died at the age of 17. So, when we think about lads that are just so desperate to do something, and his service was working in the kitchens at Craigleith War Hospital. But, valid, just as valid at 17, and he must have been extremely proud to be part of the forces there. But him. Yeah. The common misconceptions that a lot of people have is that if, you die and, as a result of war service, you get the Commonwealth War Graves headstone, of which, you can see quite a lot of around here. But that's not the case, because people were also given the opportunity to have their names basically maintained and kept up on what private memorials. So these two here are actually Commonwealth war graves, even though they don't, the family chose not to have the stone. And that is it's an absolute nightmare nowadays, because obviously it's such a shame, because the person, the people that were going to be keeping the stone in good maintenance are on the head. So, it's like the children died, and then obviously when the parents pass away, then we end up in a situation like this. So this stone here actually commemorates 3 brothers, all of whom were killed in 1918, and 2 of whom died within a week of each other in 1918. So Thomas, who is actually buried here, this is his grave. He was a regular soldier in the First Black Watch, and he was one of the very, very first members of the British Expeditionary Force to be over there in August and September 1914, and he went right the way through the war. Believe it or not, we don't know what he died of. For whatever reason, the registry office can't find his death certificate, but again, probably likely to have died in Craigleith War Hospital, somewhere like that. His brother Charles died 10 days before him. He was actually killed in action in France. And his youngest brother, Robert, he was in the Canadian forces, but he'd actually walked over the border from Duluth. He was a stonemason in Minnesota, and had actually come over the border to enlist in the Canadian forces. I think it's probably fair to say that Robert wasn't a natural soldier. His service record is a litany of fights, drunkenness. He actually did 70 days field punishment number 1 for being drunk in a frontline trench, and that is literally chained up in public for 2 hours a day. But his bravery did not fail him in
I can hardly blame them for that. I mean, we can just how they could get hold of the alcohol.
Yeah. I don't know where he was getting it from. This is quite an interesting little thing, because obviously so far we've been taking you around to see people that are here, but now we're taking you to see somebody that isn't. As you can see, there's sort of like a bit of a pregnant gap here, where clearly there's been 4 headstones and one's been taken out. And it's, again, not a particularly well-known thing, but the Commonwealth War Graves Commission cares for German and Austrian graves as well, and they look after 20,000 German and Austrian graves, and there are 5,000 German and Austrian graves here in the UK, and that was one of them. Bizarrely enough, yeah. So that was the grave of a great German naval hero. This chap, I'll show you his photograph. uh, Alexander Erdmann, and he was the captain of SMS Blucher. So it was sort of like a battle cruiser, and essentially in the Battle of Dogger Bank in January 1915, the German fleet had basically gone out to try and ambush the British, but had been in turn counter-ambushed, and they ran for home. But unfortunately, the Blucher was cut off, and Erdmann fought for his life. They fought like a tiger, but unfortunately, as you can imagine, they were massively outnumbered, and the ship went down. But Erdmann was actually pulled out of the water alive. He'd sort of, was presumably going to go down with the ship, but the lads that were brought up, and thanks for John for these ones, they were actually taken prisoner and were marched into Edinburgh with an escort of the 5th Royal Scots. So that's the Black Watch Memorial at the top of the mound. And we can see the usual schoolboys that were out to jeer and all the rest of it. But apparently there was a really, really respectful crowd, and they actually almost drew like a smattering of applause as they were marched through the town because of the way that they basically tried to hold off pretty much the entirety of the British fleet on their own. But Erdmann was in the Castle War Hospital. Have you ever been to the National War Museum? That was a military hospital at that time, and he was brought out with terrible exposure, and he was apparently yellow from head to foot with the picric acid fumes from the British shells that had actually been exploding on the boat. So he was dyed bright canary yellow, but unfortunately died of his wounds and was laid to rest here. And you can see this is a great photograph that John's put together. This is his funeral cortege coming down here to the cemetery in 1915, and there they are actually entering into the cemetery. So he was buried here just as a lone grave. However, in the 1950s, as an act of reconciliation, we basically said, right, wouldn't it be nice if we got together all these scattered German graves and put them in one place? And so as a result of that, Cannock War Cemetery was established, and this is where he is today, and the men that are buried around him are men from his crew. So a great deal of effort was made to put them back together rather than being in like these scattered graves. So Axel von Schoenmark was another officer from Blucher as well. So they're now all buried together as a crew again, which is quite nice. Happy days, happy days. So this is known as the screen wall here in Echo Bank, and this was built in 1925. Essentially, the areas behind us and in front of us here were known as the common plots. So this is essentially where, if you weren't particularly well endowed with money, you could respectfully bury somebody, but you didn't have the opportunity to put a headstone up afterwards. So all of these men here were buried in unmarked graves in this common area of the cemetery. So in 1925, obviously, as we've said, everybody needs to be commemorated individually by name, and so this screen wall was established here. And there are really quite some astonishing stories here. Private Norman of the Scottish Horse, he served in Gallipoli. We often think about it just being like France and Belgium and stuff like that, but he fought over there in Gallipoli. And when we think of Gallipoli, we think of it as sort of like roasting red hot, dusty sand. No, where he met his end, believe it or not, was in the Great Storm, when there was a huge snowstorm in November of 1915, and he contracted tuberculosis in that, and as a result died of his injuries over here. We've also got William Leyden of the wonderfully named HMS Champagne. HMS Champagne was torpedoed by a U-boat in October of 1917, and I'll actually show you. That was Champagne. It was sort of like an armed civilian liner that had been converted, and that shows the moment. Quite an astonishing photograph of the ship actually breaking in half as the lifeboats were rowing away. Even to this day, even though the boat was sunk off the coast of the Isle of Man, they're not actually certain of where the wreck is, so they don't actually know where Champagne is now. But your man William here was washed ashore in Morecambe Bay and buried here. Now, this lad is a great favourite of mine, William Sweeney. William Sweeney. Now, he was sort of like what you might call like the archetypal British Expeditionary Force regular. His service record is extremely interesting, to put it very delicately. It details all his tattoos. He was absolutely covered in tattoos, this man, all up his arms, all up his legs, all over his back, had a battleship across his chest. Yeah, absolutely amazing. And he was a regular soldier in the Royal Scots. Now, he got into a few scrapes in his times, as you might imagine, because he was basically based here in Uttar Pradesh, in one sort of like these military cantonments. He's crimed in 1911 for being blind drunk on duty, unfortunately. And this is what happens, though, you know, when these lads are cooped up in barracks. So 1912, he'd obviously got off the barracks because there are then 60 pages of treatment for an interesting infection which he'd obviously picked up around the area. But you can imagine. But he's brought back to the UK and then sent to France with the Second Royal Scots in 1914. And it's actually here at the Battle of Aubers Ridge where he was hit by shrapnel on the 9th of May 1915. They tried their best to sort of like to save him. His hospital records still survive, but he died in Craigleith War Hospital, and it does actually say that he was attended by his family at the moment of his passing. So at least you know, he had that there. So he was quite a lad, was young Mr. Sweeney. But let's have a little look. What did they say about him? Because it's got his conduct report there, and despite the fact that he'd had all this, it says, there we go, he was a good worker, never gives trouble, is honest and reliable. So a nice little personal story, despite the fact of the slight, you know, interesting medical case there, but it's absolutely fine. People are people. Very well, folks, we'll close then with a story from the Second World War. Now, comparatively, there are not that many Second World War graves in here. You know, if you can imagine, the cemetery had been operational for about a century before the Second World War came around, so it was pretty full up. But we'll close with the story of Norman Smith. Obviously, a lot of the people that we've been visiting today, you know, are buried because they've died of wounds, they've died of illness. Norman here was actually killed in action, flying operationally. Yeah, so he was part of a Lancaster crew. And here is the crew that you can see here, and that's Norman at the front there. So he was the navigator. You can see sort of like the pilots there, they've got the various different sorts of brevets on, but he was the navigator of a Lancaster that had been tasked to go and bomb Turin, believe it or not. Yeah, you know, when we think about the Second World War, we don't often think about sort of, you know, like attacks on Italy. But their crew was the crew of aircraft L of 467 Squadron. It was an Aussie squadron, but basically these were all Scottish lads in the crew. And their aircraft was L Lisbeth. And you can just about see Lisbeth there, because Lisbeth, who was a WAF at the station at RAF Bottisford, was the fiancée of the pilot. So they've been tasked, as you can see there, on the 12th, 13th of July to attack Turin. And that is actually a photograph of that attack there, sort of like with the target markers going down and all the incendiary bombs. They just dropped the bomb load and they were coming out over the target when they received a direct hit from an anti-aircraft shell, which heaven knows, you know, how they survived this, but the shell seems to have gone straight the way through the fuselage, but didn't explode. So, you know, you might think, like, how lucky is that? So, yeah. But what actually happened was it severed the elevator controls. So essentially they could neither climb nor dive. But these little trim tabs here were manually wound up or down, and the pilot realized that he could sort of like actually control the aircraft by these two tiny little trim tabs on the tail. So he managed to fly all the way back from Turin with essentially an aircraft that was pretty much out of control all the way back. Absolutely astonishing. At the airbase there, as you can imagine, Lisbeth, the WAF, was sort of waiting there. Each aircraft was coming in, landing in turn, and they were standing there in the ops room. No word from L Lisbeth. Finally, though, a great roar of delight came up because they radioed in, right? And I've got a little uh, eyewitness account. So they were pretty much at the point of saying like, well, I don't think they're coming back, love, sort of thing, when we heard Lisbeth to Bedrock, over, i.e. base, their base. Lisbeth, Aerodrome 1000, over. Lisbeth, Aerodrome 1000, I have no elevator control, I'm flying on trimmer, have 15 minutes of fuel, over. You may pancake, over. Lisbeth to Bedrock, Roger, thanks, out. So they were coming in, and as they were literally over the end of the runway, they put the undercarriage down. And the way that the Lancaster undercarriage worked, it only had a motor on one side. So one wheel came down first, and then the second followed it on like a master and slave unit. And that set up a flexion in the aircraft. And it was just that tiny little bit of snaking that ripped the tail off the aircraft, and it crashed straight the way over the runway. Yeah, and the whole crew were killed. Yeah, the whole crew. They were literally about 30 seconds from safety. And many years later, an eyewitness wrote, I wanted to swallow, but I couldn't. Someone said the crash bell, i.e. the fire alarm, and I leant over it for a long time, though there seemed to be no point. The fire truck had gone immediately, but anyway, nobody could be alive in that inferno. The crowd had all gone, and there, standing there just as I had left her, was Lisbeth. There was no tears, nothing. She just stood there as if her life had seemed to drain out of her until another girl led her gently away. Yeah, very, very sad. So they were so close to safety. They were so close to safety. But yeah, the story of Norman Smith. Good lad. Yeah.